Chapter 17 33rd Lines, Breach of Quarantine, United Galactic Response. Flashes of lights blasted the void as hundreds of ships fell from FTL speeds in a unified deceleration along the 33rd Lines, and right off the bat, things were messy. It was beyond a mess. Absolute chaos was a better description. If ships could be considered melee units, well, it was safe to say that punches were thrown. The millions of pieces of scrap that waited for them were all potentially infected, from the ship parts that had somehow held up to the floating corpses of their prior crews. So, in response, the heavy military cruisers did what they did best and set their shielding output to vaporize. If there was one sure way to keep the consumption from spreading, it was to burn it until it ceased to be. Molecular structures, alien biology, gray goo, it didn't matter what it was. If something was heated up to the temperature of a small star, it didn't stick around the way it used to. What the shields didn't deal with, the mercurial laser systems did. That did create a lot of visual interference, though. Quite a bit. Over 100 of the core species had thrown their fleets towards the breach, and behind the shelter provided by the first couple hundred of Union military ships, thousands of such ships began to spread out in the grid, a formation that relied almost fully on pilot guidance. Calibrations were made automatically, certainly, but until the ships could re-establish the containment array on their parameters, they were completely under the control of their crews. Behind them, a sweep was being performed by kill squads. Mercy protocol applied to anything. No exceptions could be made. Civilian vessels, planetary platforms, colonies. Nothing was the exception. It was no surprise most of those crews were hired mercenaries, cutthroats, and Senate-paid affiliates. Few species had the stomach for glassing a colony, and it helped to have loose affiliation for the ones that did. With so much occurring so quickly, well, mistakes could happen. The Traitors Guild was called many things. Some spoke of it as an ancient family, a brotherhood that spanned species and generations. Others considered it a cult, or a mob, an organized ring of borderline criminals that worked in the gray between moral values. Others still considered it a network, where things were known and secrets sold. A rare few knew the truth of its purpose. It was the Union's only true rival. For as long as the Union existed, there was always the minority that disagreed. Some would be bent by the force of politics to kneel at the feet, tentacles, and claws of the core worlders that carried its mantle. Some would flee to the edges of the influence, avoiding the dangers that swam and circled within. Some, though, abide by the rules and play the game, and then play it well enough to cheat. For everything a species gained by joining the union of intelligent life, they lost just as much. For every force, there is another equal one opposing, and eventually it is found that entropy is the only true winner. The galactic body of the Union was a necessary evil by majority decision, and it was decided long before any who currently lived even existed. It was the one and the only option. There was no other. Agreements could be forced on a new arrival. Trade, land, resources, protection, it didn't matter what. All had their own price, and to gain back what was lost, a species would have to play the game. Some played better than others. Perhaps a natural inclination, an innate skill in politics had been present. Or, possibly, the ability to communicate in ways other species could not understand, even with the variety of translators that flooded the markets. As many fell, some would find themselves rising, and the smartest of those would hide such a fact. In the background of this all, the guild came into existence. Of no one particular species, it started as a mere agreement in secrecy. Unlike the Union, it was based on trust before commitment. As it grew more successful, that trust became key. Its members could play the games of the Union, but they did so not for necessity, but for camouflage. It was found that trades done without the Union watching, for better or worse, came to be far more profitable. Of course, this brought all manner of legal and morally questionable situations and individuals by its very definition. Over time, though, these simply became layers, which stacked upon layers, which stacked upon secrets. The Traitors' Guild was called many things, because it was. At the core of the guild were the shipmasters. From many species, these brave individuals upheld the ideals of all who lived along the fringes, to travel the worlds and void alike, support the colonies on the frontier and explorers of the unknown planets beyond them. Most importantly, they were fiercely independent. The Union held no sway over them, and no politics would buy them. They existed outside of interference. And at this very moment, they were in a panic. What had started as a panicked sending of a mere 30 vessels had turned into a gathering of thousands. The greatest trade ships in the verse and their shipmasters had agreed to dock at the gathering station, all because of one message that had barely been capable of translation. The Union has been compromised. Its ID had been sent with a maximum issued emergency tag. If that hadn't been enough, the message had been passed on a set frequency that was complete with 3 layers of security tagging and a bioscan of its sender. It was a death note. The death note of Sethal Trohan, elected representative of the Rula. To say chaos and pandemonium were present in the meeting hall would have been a vast understatement. The shipmasters and their beasts were all present, and they were furious. From Hellion of the Shell, Izai's Seeker of the Depth, to Dervash of the Legion, all with their collared defenders obediently at their sides. Still, none were as angry nor vocal as Saito of the Wrathbringer. The Rula stood at least a full unit above all others in the room, and bore a sole gigantic scar that traveled down his entire torso. Saito had earned his title hundreds of times over during his career as the most dangerous shipmaster alive. On his first trade expedition, he was betrayed by his crew and left to die on a high-gravity world set for quarantine and annihilation. That was where he had collared and tamed his beast, a prime dragling, and obtained rescue. To this day, it was the only prime within inhabited space not locked behind the metal bars and a shock field of a Union preserve. A level 13 threat assessment. Not another being had ever tried to tame one since, much less attempt to simply place a collar on its barbed scales. The rumor went that all who had betrayed him had ended up traveling down that creature's gullet. This was substantiated by the fact that he still piloted his original ship, a large and beautiful carrier, complete with a set of haywire pulse cannons and a single array-class turret. Saito the Wrathbringer had not come to wear his scaled cloak through peace. The creature at his side shared his fury as it let out a sound that filled the room with a deafeningly horrible scream of rage before clamping its jaws together in a furious crack. The din silenced immediately. The time to listen had arrived. Even those who had not met Saito knew to hold their tongues after a display such as that. As his 4 lower limbs pushed his body forward toward the stage in the center of the chamber, his free arms drew 2 blades and clanged them together, showering sparks out above him. Each blade represented a piece of his heritage, for they were traditional weapons, much like their war bows. Only Rula could wield the things with skill and strength, and Saito was the strongest of them all. As he reached the center, he reared up on his lowermost limbs. Throwing the 2 swords in the air, his lower limbs caught the blades with ease as his upper limbs raised with his voice. "Here we are, brethren, and the time has finally come to be." His voice bellowed out over the many watchers. "Our inner circles, those who have observed and guided our path, have come upon the news that will shake the very galaxy which we inhabit." A quiet cheer arose from many in the crowd, but many more remained silent. Semantics were not what they came for. They wanted more than that. "For those of you who do not know me, I am Saito the Wrathbringer. For those of you who know that, fewer know my true name." With emphasis, he launched one of his blades into the air, a deadly spin that fell point down to stick into the stage before him. "The weapon before you belongs to the family line of the Trohans." Any cheering that had still been whispering through the crowd ceased. "I tell you this in hopes that you will join me. Before this cycle is complete, I will rally the Rula battle fleets under my blood. I will sweep the inner systems, and I will avenge my brother and his allies." Thousands of shouts came to greet him, and he soaked them in. Some were in support, some against, but it didn't matter. The guild was rallied to this cause, and the shipmasters were held to their oaths. If they could not defend the citizens of their homeworlds, no one would. The quarantine had held their attention from the dangers close at hand for far too long. They would not let this corruption and murder go unrewarded. "We go to war." End of Act 1. There are misconceptions about space, distance, and time. It stems from the basic fact that none of us can really comprehend any of these things, and we are forced to rely on rough estimations and guesses. Our very existence is something of an enigma we never quite solve. If we were to comprehend, to fully grasp the scale of the universe, there is little debate over the matter. One's head would likely explode. This is just a simple fact. Infinity can't be understood on an intimate level, and between you and the next object in a room, one could debate there is an infinitely vast amount of space and time. You could look closer at something forever and never reach an end. Distance is therefore a fickle thing to try and wrap one's mind about. If this is to be accepted, one must understand that life could not exist if it lacked the ability to accept, generalize, and ignore. Frontier life was, in its essence, a monument to those 3 principles. When your life is a constant testament to survival, and the entire planet could turn against you at any time, well, you could expect individuals in this circumstance to be very good at all of those things. What wasn't right in front of you, beneath your feet, or on your fields was mostly irrelevant. Thus it was for those that live on the very edge of the galaxy. Only a select few may have become aware of a strange fact about the void. If you look closely, and then closer still, one might find that it isn't quite empty. Certainly not as empty as one would believe the black of space should be. As to why someone along the frontiers would bother with such a thing is a reasonable debate in and of itself. But a small portion would regardless, and a smaller portion still would see the impossible. Scattered about the black between galaxies and their vast swirling storms of matter, energy, and perhaps life, there is little to nothing, a generalization that all but overlooks the fact that there is something beyond. In the great expanse of almost nothing, lone stars float along with their systems, along with leftover matter and debris that has escaped the clutches of the large forces of gravity in the near infinite distance. For the unfortunate circumstance of life to evolve on one of these rare stars, they would be trapped by the sheer impossibility of escape. When you're 60 million light years, perhaps more, from the nearest galaxy, there is nowhere to go. Indeed, an entire civilization would rise, live, grow, and die without ever leaving such a purgatory. It is more than likely that this has been the case when one considers the infinite possibilities that lurk in the ever-distant sky. A rare few, though, might look at such a distance and consider it a challenge. Rarer still, a species may find a way to conquer it, provided the correct motivation. Even if it takes them entire generations, entire lives of those who would never be anywhere but between the gap, so to speak. No matter where you go, survival, curiosity, and revenge are of the strongest motivators life will ever possess. As it was, humanity possessed them all. Unlike the military ships that had guarded their flight from the system, the ring ships possessed a means of FTL travel. It wasn't quick, not to start, but it was possible. The longer they flew across the unknown, the faster they became. Their escape was not just from the enemy, but the galaxy itself that threatened to consume them. When the crews finally manned their ships to reach the decided refuge in the black, the rest of humanity awoke from their cryosleep. It had taken them 200 years. The crews had taken shifts on 20-year rotations of loneliness and solitude, so that when they finally arrived, they could stand together one final time. Their bodies were buried on the fertile soil of New Earth, their names etched in pillars of glass, metal, and stone. Their sacrifice would never be forgotten, and that ground would be forever sacred. Of the hundreds of ring ships that had left Earth as refugees, only 73 had survived the journey. Some had been lost to the will of luck, a comet or an asteroid. Some had suffered malfunction and fell from their long acceleration to coast the void alone, millions of years from refuge. Humanity truly did mourn those first years. It was said long ago that Phoenix must burn to rise again. Mankind rose from the ashes of their very mantle, and from the corpse of their very heritage they stood. In the distant sky, a beautiful, milky spiral taunted them. From those same ashes, hands reached down and gripped the still burning coals while blood trickled off them into the foreign soil. Humanity did not forget.